My name's Paul Loeb. I do books on citizen activism, Soul of a Citizen and The Impossible Will Take a Little While are probably the two best known. And basically I focus on how citizens can find a voice and overcome their own hesitations, draw other people in, and how you keep on for the long haul as long as needed to make the kinds of changes that we have to make.
Great. So our movie that we're making is about pointing to revolutions of the past. We're trying to tell people what it's going to take to survive the next 100 years.
Right.
And so in your eyes, what makes up a revolution? What would be needed to start a revolution?
What's needed is massive citizen.
Revolution, do what we need to do here.
What we need is massive citizen participation. I mean, if we're really talking, the problems aren't the technologies. I mean, the technologies to avert climate disaster are either around here or they're fairly close over the horizon. But what we don't have at this point is the political consensus to actually make sure that we create this shift. And that's not going to happen by simply waiting for the governments to enact the programs. It has to happen with massive citizen participation. And so, I mean, it doesn't matter even whoever's in the States, in Canada, France, Germany, they're certainly going to be better or worse, more or less sympathetic leaders. I mean, the US is coming out of a period of extreme climate denial. I hope that that's now buried for good. But even when you're talking about political leaders who acknowledge that the crisis is there and the crisis is real, they're still facing powerful interests, the oil lobby, the coal lobby, that are making it difficult. And the only thing that's going to be able to overcome that is the ability of ordinary citizens to act. And I use, for example, in a model in the US civil rights movement, Presidents Kennedy and Johnson were basically sympathetic to the movement, but initially held it at arm's length. And they knew it was volatile, they knew that it might shatter their electoral coalition, as it did when it turned the South Republican for basically 40 years. And they were hesitant, they were saying, caution, go slow. Of course we agree with your goals, but go slow. And it was the ordinary activists who basically put it on the agenda until Johnson was president at that point, stake all his political capital on passing the Civil Rights and the Voting Acts bills. And without the ordinary activists, that never would have occurred. I think we have an analogous situation here, pretty well in every country, where you have, again, more or less sympathetic leaders who recognize it, don't recognize it, but there's a gap between, in almost everywhere, what they're saying is politically achievable, politically feasible, and what the climate science actually says needs to be done. And that gap is only going to be overcome with citizen activism. And what that means is the ordinary people saying, I may not know everything, I may not be a climate scientist, most of us aren't, but nonetheless, what I recognize is that the overwhelming consensus of climate scientists in the world says this is real and urgent. That is enough for me, rather than listening to the counsels of the Exxon and coal-funded denial institutes. And if they say it's real, my job as a citizen is to convince my elected representatives, whatever country I'm in, wherever they are, that they need to act and they need to risk and they need to stick their necks out. So that to me is critical. Without the voice of ordinary citizens, you're going to have people saying, all right, well, this is a problem we have to deal with. We'll deal with it eventually. We'll make some modest steps. And what we need is far greater than that.
And I mean, it seems like now with our new president, it seems like there's, even just on Power Shift here, there's almost a new era of energy now. It seems like, we've spoken to a few people who've been here in the first one in 2007. I mean, is that arm's length, has it now been shortened?
The arm's length has been vastly shortened. I mean, I was one of the main stage speakers in '07, and DC felt like occupied territory. I mean, it's this, these people have come in from Texas and they've taken over and they're busily dismantling democracy. They're denying reality in every turn, including climate change. And you go from there to having a Nobel Prize winner scientist in charge of, energy policy who's been speaking out on climate change himself for years, an enormous shift. And sympathetic, the Secretary of Energy coming to speak to Power Shift, enormous shift. And somebody like Obama, who's recognized, who sponsored climate change legislation, enormous shift. So two things have to be true. One is recognize the magnitude of the shift. In a context like this, recognize the key role that young people played in that shift, because without their votes and their volunteering, Obama would not be president. At the same time, recognize that everyone in that administration, everyone in Congress, everyone in the Senate, sympathetic as they are, they're going to still be looking over their shoulder politically a lot of that time. And it falls on ordinary citizens like the people gathered at Power Shift to be able to both say to them, you can take the risks and we'll have your back. You go out on a limb, and we understand you're going out on a political limb because you're going to be accused of destroying jobs in the middle of a recession and a global economic crisis, that we're going to have your back, and we're going to be doing the explaining, knocking on doors and making phone calls to the people when they come time to vote to say they did the right thing and they were courageous and they ought to be honored and rewarded for it. And at the same time, putting the pressure on the legislators to push what's necessary through, and putting the pressure on even the most sympathetic administration, which is why the Kennedy and Johnson parallels are appropriate, to be able to say, look, here it is, you folks have to take the risk, and we know it is a risk, but nonetheless you have to do it because the crisis demands it. And that's a tall order, but again, it really devolves on us, the watchers, the viewers, the participants, as opposed to leaving it to even the best-hearted, best-intentioned people in Washington, D.C., or in Ottawa, or in Paris, or wherever.
I'll take this on a bit of a different slant, because it just occurred to me. I mean, we're here in the United States. There is so much passion and so much power. And being Canadian, every time I come to the U.S., I feel it. I feel the passion.
Right.
It fuels me. It energizes me. We have it in Canada, but it's not the same. And in different parts of the world, it's different. Our state where we're at right now, we're all talking about the U.S. This Power Shift event is in the U.S. We have a new president in the U.S. It's a very exciting time. Right. What can we say about the different parts of the world, like in India and United Arab Emirates, these other parts of the world that are starting to really pique people's interest? China's right. The global population. I mean, how is all this going to interplay as this revolution builds in the U.S. if we have this this critical time right now? How is it? How are we all going to be able to pool together? I mean,
there's sets of interconnected problems. So there's the EU, and there's the other advanced industrial company, Japan, Canada. There's the United States, which has been the biggest obstacle and the biggest greenhouse gas emitter, and per capita still is. If you do not deal with the U.S., global climate change is impossible to solve. You then have separate questions for countries like India and China that are beginning to develop, that don't want the door slammed in their face and saying, sorry, heat your house, have with ice on the walls in the winter and just live with that. It's a reasonable thing to expect. It may not be a reasonable thing to expect 3 SUVs, but it's a reasonable thing to say we don't want ice in the walls in the winter. And so I would say that it falls on the developed countries, or whatever word you use for them, to be able to subsidize and to help transfer the technologies to the developing world that says you should be able to have some things that we have had for a long time, but without having to go through the path that we have gone that is absolutely unsustainable. And so that's it's a significant challenge to the developed countries. The other thing, people are I've seen congressional debates where those resistant to inaction in the U.S. on climate change, they blame China. Well, we can't do anything. It's all in China. China's the biggest emitter. They don't talk about all the factories from the U.S., some of them from U.S. companies, that are now producing in China so that their global carbon footprint goes under China's register. It doesn't go in the U.S., but nonetheless, it's a U.S., or the advanced industrial world's consumption market that's fueling it, and the profits are flowing to the U.S. This may change with the economic collapse. The profits may start flowing to China from the U.S. But this is the way it has been at this point. And so what I would argue is that every country has a responsibility to lead as much as it can. Some countries obviously have smaller footprints, some have larger. But for instance, when I went to Denmark and watched how there was basically in the words of the energy minister who helped in the 70s when they had their oil crisis. Essentially, Denmark had no renewable energy. They had no coal, no hydro, no oil. They had no internal energy sources. And what they did when the energy crisis happened is they subsidized renewables by purchasing them at a guaranteed rate, and they had local projects to basically subsidize energy efficiency consulting in every town and city. And the result is, in the words of the energy minister at the time, that a company called Vestas, that he said was 2 steps above a blacksmith shop, is now the largest wind turbine producer in the world and the export engine of the Danish economy. And so essentially, you have a very small country like Denmark, nonetheless taking the lead in a way that both benefited their country but benefits us globally by developing these technologies. And so wherever you are, there's a responsibility, and certainly in the US, to point a finger at anybody else makes no sense whatsoever. But to say you have to lead from wherever, even in the US, my mayor in Seattle, I guess it was 3 years ago now, looked around, saw the Bush administration doing nothing on climate change, said, look, we have to do something. I can do something. I'm a mayor of a mid-sized city, and got together with, I think it was 6 other mayors, and issued a declaration, the mayor's climate declaration, to try and meet the Kyoto standards of reductions in their own cities. There's now something like 1,000 cities in the United States that have signed on to it. And my city of Seattle, in fact, did meet and is starting to decrease further past those standards within a 3-year time. Challenged the corporations doing business in the city, with the result that Starbucks, which is out of Seattle, basically pledged to have the same reductions in all of their global operations, and has done that. Huge global cement manufacturer called Lafarge did the same. So you look at those things and you see action coming from all sorts of points. And I think this is critical, because a lot of times people will say, well, I live here, I'm not at a center of power. And the point is that on an issue like this, any place, particularly with the communications technologies we have, any place can be a center of power, because it can be a center of initiative and a center of organizing that then leaps to other cities, to other countries, to other states or provinces. And that should empower us all. But I think a lot of times what happens is that people, they feel like they can't. I call it the perfect standard. It was one of my books, Soul of a Citizen. I explored it. And where the idea is, unless you knew everything about every facet of an issue, you dared not speak out. So you had to be a climate scientist to speak out on climate change. Well, the climate scientists are speaking out, but there aren't enough of them to change the political landscape. So it really does fall on the rest of us to say, all right, we may not know every single answer about every single question somebody might ask us, but we do know what the overwhelming consensus of the scientists who are working on this is. And their consensus is that we are in enormous trouble if we do not act immediately and take this as seriously as any crisis that humans have ever faced. You don't have to be a climate scientist to recognize that, to articulate that. You nearly have to say, this is what they're finding, it's up to us to act.
And now that challenge, that block, was one of the things that we really want to delve into. And people are intimidated to speak up, and it's starting to happen more and more now. People are changing their lives. But what is it? If we could try and push that button in people, what's the mental block? Is it psychological? What is it, and how can we trigger it in people to
overcome it?
Yeah, to overwhelm it, to give them the power to want to stand up and make that change in their life and live that.
Well, the power is to recognize the power that they have. That they do not need to know everything. They do not have to be saints. They do not have to be as eloquent as King and saintly as Gandhi and on the other. They can be themselves, who they are, with all their limitations, with all their hesitations, with all their doubts, and they can still act, and they can still make an enormous difference. I use the example of Rosa Parks, which everyone thinks they know the story, but they know it wrong. The image they have is one day out of nowhere, this woman acted on her own and things instantly changed. None of that is true. She was part of a whole community with the NAACP that she'd built as an activist for 12 years. She was the secretary of the NAACP local in Montgomery, Alabama. There was a community that had worked alongside her. She went to training sessions the summer before her arrest, a place called Highlander Center, and worked with other civil rights activists from an earlier generation to figure out how to have the most effect. So it wasn't an unconscious, accidental act. It was a deliberate act calculated to make change. What she didn't know, because you never can, is the ultimate impact that it had. And it took persevering. It took a dozen years from her first NAACP meeting to the time on the bus that we've all heard about. And so if I look at that model, what it says is you jump in and you don't know where your life is going to end up, who you're going to bring in. The other thing that's interesting is if you say, who influenced Rosa Parks? Well, we know that her husband, Raymond Parks, who was a barber, was involved in the NAACP as a co-founder of the Montgomery local, got her involved. We don't know the people who got him involved. Their names are not in the history books. And yet, without them, I would argue that you would not have had Raymond Parks involved, and you would not have Rosa Parks involved, and you would not have that stand on the bus that we all know globally. And that we could be the people who if not making this critical change, we bring somebody else in who could. I mean, Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Kenya, described being a student at a small college in the middle of Kansas, and the social justice conversations there got her involved. She goes back to found what they call the Green Belt movement in Kenya, planting trees, bringing into resistance against the dictatorship, ends up winning the Nobel Peace Prize. So it's possible that in our community we have a future Nobel Peace Prize winner, but only if we get them involved. And I think that that should make us feel fairly powerful. I think that that should give us a sense of possibility. It's the same way that Václav Havel, the former Czech president, when he was talking about the growth of their democracy movement, he described a moment where they were circulating a petition to free some political prisoners. They did not succeed in freeing those prisoners. And so the critics who mocked them for their efforts, and there were a lot, he said, well, maybe they're right. And then he realized, no, they're not, because the people who got involved signing that petition, that first step, that wasn't their last step. They went on to speak out, put on dissident plays, music, speak in the classrooms, in the pulpit, challenge the regime in 100 different ways. He said, you know, they will end up he wrote this right before, 3 years before '89, when they had their Velvet Revolution and the Berlin Wall fell in Berlin and Solidarity triumphed in Poland. He said, they will overthrow this dictatorship. And they did it by taking very small first steps that then grew into larger steps. And so again, no matter when we're acting for any goal, we should recognize that the immediate outcome is, of course, hugely consequential. Lives may hinge on it. But nonetheless, even if we fail, if we bring enough new people in, one of them, or one or more of them, may go on to do something enormously powerful that ends up benefiting the planet. And that's a fundamental lesson for all of our work.
Could you draw any parallels between this current financial crisis and the economic crisis, and any possible similar solutions that we could come up with?
Well, I mean, I would argue that if you look at the financial crisis, which started in some sense in the U.S., spread globally in part because everybody was buying into the same speculative fever, you know, it's the notion that says you can get free wealth. You can, you know, if you get the right angle and the right, well, scam or con is too harsh, but it really is. You know, it's not, the crisis was generated not by producing real goods. It was by an economy that had shifted to speculation. The phrase casino economy has been used. And the casino suddenly went bust, and now all of a sudden everybody's over-legislated, and the whole thing starts crumbling down. What the real economy does is to say, what are the genuine needs of human beings? How do you meet them? And what kind of production could meet them? And how do you do that in a way that does not destroy the earth? So essentially what you had is a fundamentally unsustainable economy in its own terms, which then crashed. And what will emerge immediately afterwards is an economy, some of which is environmentally sustainable and some of which is not environmentally sustainable. And we have to be able to move to the point that says, look, it is possible with the technologies and the human creativity we have to generate our power, our heat, our light. I mean, I look at the solar panels on the roof of my house and I watch my meter running backwards, and this is in cloudy Seattle, and it's like amazing. You can actually, yes, the sun can generate electricity. It is not theoretical. It is running my computer and refrigerator and lights even on relatively cloudy days, and it's possible. So what does that mean? It's been generating my electric water heat for quite a while. Well, the issue then becomes, how do you make the technology affordable? How do you make it affordable for people who don't have any discretionary savings? How do you subsidize it? How do you subsidize the development so that the cost continues dropping? I mean, on wind it is now equal with coal. On solar, photovoltaic, it's not quite there yet. Solar thermal, it's even. You want to be able to price the destructive approaches so high that they start withering away, and subsidize, which is part of what Denmark did 30 years ago that's put them in good shape, subsidize the approaches that are sustainable so that they in fact can be continued. That's the real economy. And it's the real economy in terms of the earth as well as in terms of the market, the global market, or whatever one calls it. You have to do both.
And so what to you, how would you paint a picture of this perfect new economy if we could get to that sweet spot, if we could have this revolution or this change?
Well, I mean, I'm somebody who looks for the long haul, so I'm not expecting utopia or perfection in my life. I'm 56 years old. I'm probably, halfway through my life, slightly over if I live to 100, which would be really nice if I have my health. So I look at the economy and I think, will I get a just world for all by the time I die? Probably not. But I would like it to be a world that people aren't brutally exploited. I would like it to be a world where people who make goods maybe could afford to buy those same goods. And I would also like a world that has some concept of sufficiency, which is very complicated to square with an endless economy of growth. Because it's not just about the GDP expands, it's about what do people need? I mean, we need certain things. We do need a roof over our heads. Most places we need heat. Some places we need to cool the houses. We need food to eat. I would argue that we need some communications technologies by now that are available and actually not that expensive. We need education, we need healthcare. Beyond that, some level of transportation. Beyond that, it's a lot of nice toys. We don't need all the nice toys. And part of what I remember again thinking when I put in I got a new energy efficient furnace that's going to pay off in 6 years' time. Basically, my old furnace went out. I had no choice. But I looked at it and I thought, oh, okay, I can go all the way as efficient as possible. That's $5,000. And I was talking to the person who put it in. He said, yeah, that's how much a granite countertop costs. You can have nice granite countertops for your kitchen, or you can basically cut the amount of gas, in my case, that I use, or CO2, almost in half for my old inefficient furnace. That's our choice. At this point in history, I would argue that what we need to be doing a whole lot more, maybe the toys can come down the line, is figuring out how to invest our capital, our productive labor, our imagination in those technologies that will give us the transition to something sustainable, and then we can get the nice toys later on down the line. But we don't have an infinite time frame to stop the pillaging of the earth.
So do you feel confident that we can do it? Events like this, you see kids like this all around you, this is year 2. Do you feel confident, realistically, can we do it?
I feel, one of my books, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, makes the difference between hope and optimism, which actually I derive from Václav Havel. Optimism is believing that things are going to turn out the way you want them to turn out. And hope is believing in the possibility, and the possibility through your action. So I don't know if I'm optimistic, but I'm hopeful. That is, there's a lot arrayed against us, and we've gone way down that path towards annihilating the habitability of the planet for literally billions of people. I'm hopeful, though, that we can turn it around. That is, it is in our hands. It is contingent. It's a contingent world. The future of the world, if we really take seriously the notion that the future of the world depends on our choices, not just individually, not just change our light bulbs and recycle and do all those good things, but collectively, particularly collectively, and that's what's so exciting about PowerShift. You have 12,000 young people coming together to act in common with each other, as 12,000 when they get back to their campuses and their communities, because it's the common decisions that drive this. It's the cheapness of fossil fuel energy that has driven our path. It's the lack of investment in renewables that have made them more expensive than they would be otherwise. And so we have to shift that with these kinds of common actions, and I'm hopeful that it's possible. And I believe it's in our hands, and I think we can do it. Will we do it? It really is up to us. It's our choice.
Yeah, it's as simple as that. It really is just a choice.
Yeah.
That's great. Brendan, do you want to jump in with anything?
I'm okay.
Yeah, we pretty much covered everything you were. That's great. I think I've got lots of great stuff there. Amazing feedback.
Yeah.
I think that's great. Cool. That's great. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, great. Anything else? Or that's...
This movie is really about trying to harness the power of revolutions of the past, like big change, slavery, women's rights.
Okay.
We've done it in the past.
Okay. All right.
So we're trying to, harness the power of
All right.
events like
I'll
this.
talk a little bit about that because it's a lot of what I write about.
Sure. Brendan, are you going to grab?
I'm going to go grab John and Bob.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
We'll just
Yeah.
Just take a peek, and if we're still talking, just
Yeah.
give us a
Like
second.
in 5 minutes of tape, would you like us to change, or is this
We're probably okay in 5 minutes, yeah. A lot of what I write about in Soul of a Citizen and The Impossible Will Take a Little While, my other books over about 30 years, is being able to learn from the past. Those are the people who come before us who have faced the impossible odds. You look at something like the women's suffrage movement in the United States, but it's certainly true globally as well. In the US, pretty well everybody who was the core activist in that movement, they were all dead by the time women got the vote. It just took that long. Now, obviously on some things like climate change, we don't have that long. But nonetheless, we can learn from their being able to persevere even in the most difficult situations. I mean, when the abolitionists started globally, and sort of England was one of them that sort of led the way, they didn't have a say. It wasn't on the agenda. It was just, slavery is the way the world has been. It feeds our economy. It's essential. And then you ended up with a city like, I believe it was Manchester, that was one of the centers of slave shipment. I mean, the slave trade was very integrated with its economy, signing thousands and thousands of names on petitions to end the slave trade. And so part of the challenge is a friend of mine, Jim Wallace from Sojourners, Religious Social Justice magazine, he says, hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. I think that's a very powerful notion, because what it says is that what is deemed possible at one point will shift depending on the actions of ordinary people. And it's not about some woo-woo metaphysic. What it really is saying, look, if you talk to people, if you get them thinking, if you get them acting, all of a sudden new possibilities open up. And that's the task for all of us, is to be able to create those new possibilities. And that's a lesson that was true in every single revolution of the past, in every single citizen movement of the past for justice, is that something was deemed simply the way it is. This cannot change. We have always done this way. Our economy depends on it. There are all the reasons. And yet people managed to persevere, and people managed to shift seemingly unmovable forces. And now we look back and we think, oh, well, of course. Of course there's no slavery, or at least in most of the world. Of course women got the vote. But none of this was foreordained. All of it took leaps. I mean, Nelson Mandela calls it the multiplication of courage. All of it took the multiplication of courage, of one individual inspiring another individual to work in common, to shift what people deemed possible, and to raise the fundamental moral questions that drove it, and to tell the story, and basically be able to change from abstractions. In the slave trade, it was a model of a slave ship that was recreated and taken around place to place to place in the kinds of gatherings people had in the abolitionist meetings. Now it's somehow being able to say, there's a world forest fires out of control and droughts in Australia and Argentina, and ice storms that leave millions of people without power, and these are all linked. And we have to be able to understand that there's some abstraction of numbers in the atmosphere of a carbon count, and that yet it has real consequential results in Katrinas and extreme weather events, and that if we don't want that to be our perpetual global future, we need to be able to act on what we can change, which is how we produce our energy.
One of the things we want to touch on is the power of the youth. I mean, look what they did with Obama. The
Oh, yeah.
power of youth today is totally different. They look to leaders and they can act in a different way than what leaders had to take their boats around, and
Right.
It was so much harder to voice yourself as a leader. Today we've got this multi-platform media online. You can do so much. So there's so much more power and excitement in being able to make the change. What we're against is bigger, and it's more global, but we have a greater global strength.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So for following on that last thought, if we don't act, we don't shift that horizon of what seems possible, we have a potential of disaster, but we also have a potential on the other side of actually having a society that we really could be proud to pass on. And I think it's a cliche to say think about what you're passing on to your grandchildren. But in this case, in this particular historical time, it really is true. And if we were able to say we are the people alive who actually took that industrial revolution, which brought amazing things to people. I mean, we can't dismiss the benefits, and shifted it to one that, in fact, is sustainable. I mean, that would be something to live our lives being proud of. And we can do it. We do have amazing technologies now at our reach to be able to coordinate with each other, to communicate halfway across the globe in a way. I mean, they can be technologies of distraction and endless clicking on the internet. All of us probably do that too much. But at the same time, they also can connect us with each other. We come out of the Obama campaign with a sense of actually people who, they texted in their cell phone contact number, and then there they were being told whose door to knock on, and here's your call list, and here's where you show up in your local community, and actually having conversations face to face, coming out of that networking that started with those new technologies that are available. And so the challenge, I think, is just to use every tool, old and new, together to be able to act commensurate with the challenges that we face.